Hello, welcome back to our University of Missouri Extension Leasing series designed to help farmers and property owners with leasing arrangements. We're glad you're here. We have a great session for you tonight. This is our seventh one. I am Julie Harker. I am the news strategist with Kaffner Extension, and with me tonight is MU Extension's Joe Horner. Please introduce yourself, Joe, and tell us what you'll be talking about in this session.
Hi, Julie. I'm Joe Horner. I'm an agricultural economist with University of Missouri Extension. Tonight, we'll be covering farmland leasing for renewable energy production, such as wind farms, solar farms, and their associated battery and transmission connection facilities.
So some might wonder, why are we talking about these types of leases in a course about farmland leasing? Wouldn't these topics fit better in a discussion of industrial or commercial property leases?
You're exactly right. Leasing land for renewable energy production is more like leasing land for industrial purposes, such as other things that farmers lease land for, like cell phone towers, self-storage marts, outdoor advertising, or some other commercial site that we see along highways and around cities and rural areas. The reason we are covering wind and solar leasing in this series on farmland leasing is because renewable energy production is land extensive. It takes place in rural areas, and farmers can farm around energy leased land, and potentially eventually, the land leased for solar wind farms may be returned to farming needs after the lease ends.
Are we seeing more land leased for renewable energy production?
Yes, we are. There's a lot more wind leasing to the north and west of us, and we're seeing more solar leasing all around the country. Missouri has not been at the forefront of either the wind or solar leasing, but we are seeing more leasing for wind and solar installations every year. We anticipate continued interest in leasing farmland for energy production in Missouri. Wind leasing has been more common in Missouri than solar leasing in the last 5 to 10 years, but we expect to see quite a bit more land leased for solar farms. And that solar leasing will be a little different than the wind leasing in that it's going to be more distributed across Missouri than just the windy sites that have attracted wind leasing so far.
All right, let's pause for this video that talks about renewable energy production leasing.
Liquid biofuels like ethanol and biodiesel come from plants that convert sunlight to crops that produce energy. In Missouri, plants used in liquid biofuel production grow on more than 1 million acres. Utility-scale wind and solar parks also use farmland to produce energy, providing one more connection between the agricultural economy and the energy economy. Windmills and solar panels convert wind and sunlight to renewable electricity energy. Missouri acreages involved in utility-scale wind and solar are small but growing. Renewable electricity is generated in rural areas and transmitted across rural areas. Expected expansion of renewable electricity sources will create farmland leasing opportunities to more Missouri landowners. These opportunities come with land use trade-offs. Energy leases are significantly more involved than leasing farmland for crops or pasture. Missouri's electricity is generated predominantly from burning coal. U.S. electricity is currently generated predominantly from burning natural gas, with wind and solar generation increasing. In surrounding states, Iowa produces most of its electricity from renewables, with Oklahoma and Kansas close behind. Wind farms in those states continue to grow. Missouri's production of electricity from wind is also growing, outpacing annual nuclear generation for the first time in 2022. Utility-scale solar farms, growing rapidly in some states, are just starting development in Missouri. Declining costs are driving the expansion of wind and solar electricity generation. This graph depicts the unsubsidized cost of new electricity generation from different sources. In many locations, utility-scale wind and solar generation facilities are now price competitive with combined cycle gas and coal plants. Electricity is generated, sold into the transmission grid, and then bought by a distribution utility before arriving at the final consumer. Customers pay electric bills to their utility, which may be an investor-owned utility, a city-owned utility, or a member-owned electric cooperative. Landowners may receive offers to lease land for wind or solar generation from one of these familiar utility players, but more likely, the offer will come from a development company. Development companies plan, permit, and build new wind or solar generation facilities that feed electrons into the grid that is run by the independent system operator. The nonprofit independent system operators, or ISOs, manage the regional transmission grids and the corresponding wholesale electricity markets. Missouri is a meeting spot for two ISOs, both of which have a long list of renewable projects seeking permission to connect to their grid. Missouri has a lot of solar and wind projects in the ISO's interconnect queue, but not all of these may be approved and built. This is because it often takes longer to get approvals, line up the grid connections and the power purchase agreements, and obtain project financing than it does to build a wind or solar farm. Wind and solar projects can be built relatively rapidly once all permits and contracts are in place. Wind leasing clusters on windy ridges, as this map of northwest Missouri shows. Different colors represent different wind farms. The newest wind farms typically deploy generators with larger capacity. Although wind farms stretch for miles, they take up relatively small amounts of land. Because of their height and siting, wind farms can be seen for miles but not impact many farmable acres. However, building access roads, cables, and bases may impact farming operations, compaction, and water management. Utility-scale solar farms are just starting to be built in Missouri. The published integrated resource plans of Missouri's investor-owned utilities indicate larger solar farms will be built in the next 5 to 10 years. These sites take up less space than wind farms, but exclude other uses of the land. Solar farms do not have the wide visual impact that wind farms have. However, changing land use from crop production to solar generation may be disquieting to neighbors. Per acre annualized lease rates from solar developers may be significantly higher than annual lease rates for crop production.
All right, this is your reminder to type in any questions you have in the chat box, and I do see one has come in already, and Joe will answer those at the end. Joe, that chart talked about the declining cost of electricity production from wind and solar energy, which is very interesting. How much of this move to renewables is driven by climate or energy policy, and how much is driven by economics?
It's both, honestly. Both energy policy and economics are driving the growth of renewable energy production projects. Before this last year, before the change in administration, I would have said it's the declining levelized cost. That means even without subsidy, wind and solar will be the cheapest form of new generation electricity in the future. And incrementally, as utilities look for new generation, they're looking for primarily renewables. This last year, the federal government passed the Inflation Reduction Act, which incentivized more wind and solar. And so it means that there's going to be a faster movement to wind and solar than there otherwise would be. And so there's kind of a push right now that's actually kinking some of the supply chain to try to move that faster. Missouri's electricity consumption isn't really growing very rapidly, and our electricity is currently generated using predominantly a fossil fuel mix. However, as existing generating facilities are retired, more of our electricity generation will likely be generated from new wind and utility scale solar facilities, either in Missouri or imported and transmitted from other states.
Okay, the previous slide depicted all of the proposed the new wind and solar projects in Missouri, which is a lot of activity. Are those all going to be built?
Probably not, at least in the next few years. That map of projects under development reflects projects that have gotten pretty serious along the planning and intent stage, they've gone out, they've done the due diligence in the area. They've worked, these project companies have worked to the stage where they know where they're going to build these. They've got some initial contracts done, and then they approach the independent system operators. However, because of the long lead times and the approval processes inherent in this transmission planning, many of these may not be built. Of the proposed projects with applications in the independent system operators interconnect queue, historically only about 25% may go forward as planned, because every single project that gets passed through that queue and approved can impact the transmission congestion that impacts all the other proposed projects. And this is one of the big riddles we've got to solve if we're going to move towards a higher and higher level of renewables. We've got to speed up the permitting process. And there's lots of proposals, but it currently is a little burdensome. But this is important for farmers to know when they're considering signing an option to lease land for renewable energy production, because that project may or may not be built based upon approvals.
Okay. There was a slide that mentioned lease rates, showing some lease rates that seemed significantly higher than the farmland lease rates we've been discussing for annual crops. Can you explain why the lease rates are that high?
Sure. And they can be a lot, they can be 5 to 10 times higher than the annual lease rates for annual cropping. Wind and solar developers can afford to pay landowners more than the standard farmland lease rates to lease or buy attractive sites. Attractive sites are ones either in good wind production areas, or in the case of solar, near uncongested transmission lines close to substations, places where you don't have to spend millions of dollars running new lines and going through years of development. Developers are going to invest tens of millions or potentially hundreds of millions of dollars as these utility scale solar facilities get larger. They're going to invest that in installed equipment on these sites, and then they're going to harvest electrons from wind and solar for decades that basically have no energy cost. So they are not afraid to pay for the right sites and get those leased.
Okay. If a landowner is approached by a renewable energy developer, what should they do?
If you're approached by wind energy or a solar developer, our suggestion would be listen with an open mind, collect as much information as possible, consult a knowledgeable attorney before signing that option to lease.
All right. Our next video will discuss some specific things to consider.
Leasing land for renewable energy production is significantly different from other farm leases. Renewable energy leases are long, often extending 20 to 40 years. Lease rates are significantly higher, making them more attractive to landlords. Wind and solar farm development cause land use changes that may upset neighboring landowners. Lease contracts, written by attorneys for the energy developers, are as extensive and inclusive as one might expect from companies that are securing rights for decades and planning to invest millions of dollars on the property. Leasing land for farming may occur anywhere in Missouri. In contrast, leasing land for renewable energy development is likely only to occur at specific sites. For wind farms, those sites are windy ridges near existing transmission capacity. For solar farms, ideal sites are flat lands near uncongested major transmission lines close to substations and load demand. This map shows the electricity transmission network in Missouri. Leasing to a renewable energy project developer often starts with their agent contacting landowners to gauge landowner interest in leasing a specific site. Although they may not be household names like utilities, development companies have many important roles. If the project is built, development companies may eventually sell the project to a utility or another investment company, or continue to own it. For these reasons, landowners should understand that they may be dealing with different tenant companies in the future. Carefully reviewed written contracts are critical. There are three common lease documents. The first document a developer may ask the landowner to sign is a letter of intent. It does not bind the landowner to option or lease ground to the developer, but does bind him to only deal with that specific developer until the term of the agreement is finished. The second document a developer will present is the option to lease the property. Before signing this document, the landowner will want it carefully reviewed by an attorney experienced in renewable energy contracts. Finally, the lease or purchase agreement details all the lease terms. Given that the lease will likely last for decades and may affect heirs, critical thinking about the lease and careful document review is encouraged. Landowners should consider a few unique things about energy leases. A. These are long-term leases. Who will the contracted parties be 20, 30, 40 years from now? B. The amount of acreage the developer options may be significantly more than they finally develop. C. Along with the land the energy developer leases, they may need easements to run power lines or run access roads. D. Leases could exclude you from field access roads for large equipment. Pay careful attention to maps. E. Compaction, changes in water management, slopes, cut and fill for roads and tree removal, all may be required during construction. And F. Finally, do the contracts assure a removal bond is in place for the end of the contract or in case the company fails during the life of the contract? For lenders, there are two major questions if a borrower decides to lease land for wind or solar development. First, how will this impact the farm's cash flow and repayment capacity now and for the life of the loan? Second, if the optioned or leased property has to be taken off the lien securing the farm's loan, is the lender's collateral position still sufficient to meet the loan covenants? Landowners interested in leasing land for renewable energy development may want to download the free MU guides shown here and available on the MU Extension website. The guides introduce the issues involved and contain links to additional information, much of it from states that have more extensive wind and solar development. Farm operators that are considering leasing parts of their owned land to energy development companies typically need to consider these four issues. A. Will our finances be improved or harmed? Usually, lease income helps finances, but be sure to think through possible impacts, especially if the farm is operated as a business entity separate from the landowning entity. B. How will this impact our capacity to lease or buy land in the area? C. How is this lease going to impact the older generation and the younger generation? And D. What will our neighbors think? This map shows the annual additions of electricity generating capacity across the U.S. in 2021. Renewable energy leasing conversations are happening all across U.S. farm country and beyond.
All right. That's great information. We're happy to see your questions come in too. We will definitely get to those at the end. Joe, it looks like developers might be better off financially just buying the land for wind or solar farms. And so why would they choose to lease land from a landowner?
It's a good question. Financially, the developer might very well be better off buying instead of leasing, and some land is purchased. However, buying the whole acreage necessary to build a utility-scale renewable energy facility in selected areas may not be possible, given the number of landowners involved, the uncertainty of the project approval process, and honestly, the negotiating power of the landowners as they hear about a new project coming in and they know that they've got the upper hand on that. So developers often find it easier to secure options to lease and then typically option more acreage than they expect to lease. And upon getting all the approvals and getting the project financed and getting the interconnect queue request approved and getting a power purchase agreement, then they go back and they've got all the financing needed. Then they may only lease the footprint that works best for their project. So they may have a big option footprint, but they may scale it back to whatever works best for their financial project. For this reason, a landowner who negotiates the absolute highest lease rate in that initial project contract might accidentally shoot himself in the foot if developers option a lot more ground than they decide to use and they only exercise the option on the lower rate leases.
Okay. Well, can you talk a bit about who landowners should involve in their decision to lease land for energy development?
Sure. It's important for landowners to discuss with their younger partners, their younger farming partners or landowning partners or heirs, because these decisions may bind family members or heirs for decades. And it's important to also discuss this with your lender. A lender's lien on land that secures a farm loan may be impacted by any decision to lease. So lenders need to be consulted. Often lenders have someone in their organization. It may not be somebody locally, but it may be somebody in their organization who has experience reviewing wind and solar contracts. And that can be a valuable resource. I've talked with one gentleman who said he'd read over 500 wind and solar leases in his job at his lending institution. So that can give you a competitive edge in the negotiation process. And finally, consulting an attorney who's experienced in wind and solar leasing is really helpful, and an accountant so you understand how this might affect your business profitability and tax position. The dollars involved in these leases, particularly if somebody has a lot of land in a specific area, they're really significant, and people should not be afraid to reach out and pay for advice from people who have more experience in this field.
All right. Well, let's get to all these great questions that have come in. And our first one says, how does one approach a local cooperative for these types of opportunities?
That's a good question. First of all, I'd ask the question, those of us that live in rural Missouri, we think in terms of the electric company being the co-op. Co-ops actually only sell about 15% of electricity in Missouri. They have a huge geographic footprint, but they don't actually move near as much power as our big urban load centers. So they may not be the one who's interested in developing, or they may not be the one who's interested in buying. And in fact, up until this Inflation Reduction Act was passed, cooperatives, because they're nonprofits, couldn't take advantage of the tax credits and incentives that maybe some for-profit companies were. So really, they didn't have an incentive to do this, to be interested in this. And to be honest with you, as a utility, their primary concern is reliability and affordability. And if they've got a paid-for coal plant and they've got contracts in place for wind and they're not growing in their area, that cooperative may not be particularly interested in talking to producers. But if you handle it in the right manner and ask the co-op, are there any developers in our area that you're aware of that might be interested in talking with me, or who are the developers in this part of Missouri? You may have a better relationship with the co-op that way than starting to talk to them about building solar. It's kind of a hard conversation to have, but our co-ops are kind of in a hard position right now.
Okay. Thank you for that. Next question. Oil and gas lease agreements normally include royalties as payment methods. Does the same apply for solar or wind energy leases?
I'm aware of wind leases that pay on production capacity that's utilized. I'm not aware of any solar. The ones I've seen have been on straightforward cash leases.
Okay. Next question. What do you recommend for the time frame for a solar lease? I've been approached about a 90-year lease, but that seems too cumbersome.
It's really hard for those of us that are over 10 years old to even think about a 90-year lease. So I understand. I haven't personally seen one more than 50-year leases, and typically they haven't been leased for that long. They've been 25 or 30-year lease with one or two additional options to release that property. But I would tell you that once a transmission line goes in, and once a substation is in place, and once the copper wire is underground or above ground, that is going to be a very desirable place to continue to lease that facility for solar production. And the solar panels may change. We may only get 25 or 30 years out of solar panels, or even less if new technology comes in and they could change the panels. But the racking and the substation, the transmission are probably economically going to be in the same place. Just kind of like when you remodel a house, you tend to leave the bathroom and the kitchen in the same spot because that's where all the water and electric come in. We're probably going to see companies wanting to do that. But I agree with you, it's a really hard thing to think about 90 years. And I don't have a recommendation on the time frame other than you may well see a long-term lease with the option to release with a kicker for inflation annually so that your real value continues to stay at the same value.
This next one looks like a comment, but let's read what she says. One of the comments in the video was the exclusivity of energy production versus farming, but ATTRA, ATTRA, has some information on combining agri and solar, hence agri-solar. And it looks like it's there's a link in the chat, agrisolarclearinghouse.org. Have you heard of them?
Yes, and I appreciate the comment there. That agrivoltaics is a really popular issue in terms of how we're going to keep using this land for agriculture and not totally change the character of it, give our production agriculture something to do at the same time as the land. And there are some interesting projects out there. NREL, the National Renewable Energy Lab, has a really nice website of all the agrivoltaic projects around the country. I haven't seen a grant-funded one in Missouri yet, but I would say as more communities oppose utility scale solar, there will be opportunities to bring in that and ask developers to include agrivoltaics. The one that would typically work well, I think, in Missouri would be either sheep to control vegetation underneath, or pollinator plants for pollinating insects and maybe some wildlife benefits. But typically, when farmers have mentioned that, I've cautioned them with some of the contacts I've had in the industry that have told me, you know, these guys are putting in a couple $100,000 an acre into equipment, and they really are not excited about seeing tractors out there bumping around or people in the facility. So keep that in mind. We are talking about an industrial facility that can co-locate with agriculture, but not necessarily the first thing the utility wants to talk about.
All right, another question. When negotiating a lease with a renewable energy developer, should project-related outbuildings, roads, fences, etc., be incorporated into an agreement?
Yes, and most of the time they will be. And if you look at the interconnect queue, almost all of the new wind and solar facilities have got a hybrid in their planning process. And by hybrid, I mean they've got battery facilities. Because as we grow more and more renewables, we're going to be looking for more battery storage to get through that peak of the day when solar goes down and wind hasn't picked up. And so there are going to be those provisions in the lease, and roads, fences, absolutely incorporated in the agreement, and also setback and vegetation control on trees so that you don't get shading.
All right. Wanted to ask you if you've had any folks use the university resources and have success with this leasing process.
We have had people reach out to us and say, we really appreciate the publication. It just gave us some credibility when we're dealing with off-farm heirs, or we're dealing with neighbors who were approached by developers and they just didn't believe it. They thought it was bogus. They just didn't believe this was real, and they didn't think people would pay that kind of money. And their mindset was, there's something up. This is not right. And just having an unbiased source that points to what's going on in other places around the country is helpful to start conversations.
Excellent. Well, thank you for all this great information, Joe. And if any of you have follow-up questions, you can reach Joe through his email or phone, and his contact information is on the Canvas site. Thank you all for joining us tonight. I'll be back this same time next week with Katie Nooner, who will talk about livestock leasing. Thanks again, Joe, and thanks everybody. Have a good evening.